Hello folks, and welcome to the channel. Welcome back. And in this episode we're going to look if it really makes sense to put a motorbike engine into a car or into a race car. So what I have here are two identical race cars. One is fitted with a Volkswagen GT engine and the other one is fitted with a Kawasaki 900cc engine. Quite different, a car engine versus a motorbike engine. I have driven both cars on the track, and by the end of this video I'll let you know what I think was the better choice, the car engine or the motorbike engine. This is the original car engine with a volume of 1400cc. Of course it's been modified. It develops about 140 horsepower at 5,600 RPMs, and it develops a maximum torque of 178 Newton meters. The bore is 75 millimeters and the stroke is 72 millimeters. That's important because we will come back to those figures later. Here we have the motorbike engine, which is a Kawasaki Ninja 900cc engine, which develops about 143 horsepower at 10,000 RPMs and 101 Newton meters of torque. If you decide to put a motorbike engine into a race car or into a car, the first thing to consider are the physical dimensions and the practicality on how to fit it. But even more important is what kind of cooling system do you want to have on that engine. Typically in a car, cooling isn't all that good by just the airflow. You're going to need some oil cooling and water cooling. So in general, air-cooled motorcycle engines are not really suitable to be placed in a car unless you have the proper ducting. This bike right here, this engine, which is a BMW, is a water and oil cooled engine, and those are quite suitable to be fitted into a race car, and some race cars actually have BMW engines in it. The one that I fitted was a Kawasaki 900cc engine from a Ninja, which is also water cooled. And keep in mind that in some cases you may not be allowed to change the engine out of your car with a bike engine just because of the technical regulations in the class you are racing or you're driving. So keep that in mind. A motorbike engine loses out on practicality, because if you're going to install a motorbike engine into a race car that was developed for a normal car engine, you will have to adjust the chassis. You will have to adjust the mounting points where the engine is going to fit. You will have to take care of the wiring loom. You have to take care of the throttle. You have to take care of the drivetrain, because a bike engine doesn't have a differential, it doesn't have an external gearbox, it doesn't have an external clutch, and it certainly doesn't have no drive shafts in general, of course, because I know there are bikes with drive shafts. So all that needs to be considered, and it has to be installed in a way that you can maintain it so that you don't have to take the whole engine out if you need to work on it. So that takes a little bit of planning, and I'm just going to show you a few spots here where I had to change this frame to get this engine in it, compared to where we have the standard car engine in. So of course, if you're going to fit another car engine into a car that used to have a different car engine, then you also will be up to some modifications on the frame and the mounting points and so on. So as an example, here we constructed a new engine mount for this bike engine. This is a bar and a mounting point that you won't find on the original car. You also might have to modify the controls, like for instance for the clutch, you might want to go from a cable system to a hydraulic system. And it's not always easy to fit things in, because right here you can see that we had to do half a cutout in this pipe and then weld that up again just to be able to get this engine in. You also will need to deal with the exhaust, because the normal pipe that you would have on the bike is not going to fit, so you have to reroute all this. And typically a bike has a drivetrain based on a sprocket and a chain. Now for some bikes that will be different, of course, but this is also something you will need to consider and adapt. Installing a bike engine into a car designed for a normal car engine is going to be more difficult. So practicality, we're going to give it a negative. Weight has a huge influence on the performance of the car. And without any doubt, a traditional car engine, as we have here on the right, together with the bell housing, together with the gearbox, the flywheel, the clutch, but also the differential and the drive shafts, that's going to be quite a bit heavier than what we have on a motorbike. A motorbike is all enclosed. Everything is inside that one casing. The gearbox, the clutch, the flywheels, the cylinders, the pistons, the cylinder head, it's all one big unit. It has a few drawbacks, but it also has a big positive thing, and that is the weight is really a lot less. So that's why I think the bike engine is winning, so I'm going to give that a plus. But let's have a look on the bike engine that I have placed on this car on my left hand side. This is the same engine as in the car, and I think I can lift this. And I'm a very short guy and not very powerful, but if I lift this up, which I can, I think this is around 50 to 60 kilograms and not more than that. If I compare this with a car engine of the same size as the one that is inside that race car, well, this is just an empty naked block, and that is already most likely about 30 kilograms and more. If I then put the cylinder head on top of it, then it becomes, you know, even a lot more heavier. So let's see. Yeah, so this is almost near to the weight of that motorbike engine. So overall what we can say is that the bike engine really wins out in weight. You'll notice that the bike engine, the red line's at 15,000 RPM, and the sweet spot is around 10,000, 10,500, where I have the maximum horsepower. Whereas the car engine has a sweet spot at around 5,300 RPMs and a maximum of 7,000. So that is a huge difference. And now the question is, why do we have that difference? We have a car engine which is having its maximum horsepower of 140 horsepower at 5,500 RPMs. The bike engine is about the same horsepower but at 10,000 RPMs. Despite the fact that the bike is only a 900cc engine versus a 1400cc car engine, we got the same amount of horsepower. But horsepower is not everything. We still need to talk about torque. But we'll do this shortly after this little explanation. So how comes that those two engines are developing the same amount of horsepower? So let's start with the bike. If we are running 10,000 RPMs, then we know, if we divide this by 2, that every cylinder is going to provide 5,000 times a labor stroke per minute. If we do the same thing on the car, then we have the 5,500 RPMs divided by 2. That gives us 2,250 labor strokes per minute. Now obviously we have 4 cylinders, so the bike engine will deliver 20,000 times per minute a little push. The engine will have a labor stroke of 20,000 times a minute. That's a lot. On the car, that's going to be a bit different. That's going to be 11,000 labor strokes per minute. So that is a huge difference. And that is why the bike engine with a lower cc or lower volume of the cylinder, and because of the high RPMs, is able to provide about the same horsepower as the car. But that doesn't mean anything because we still need to talk about torque. So why don't we make the car engine running 10,000 RPMs? Well, that is possible, but that would mean a completely different engine. And in general, car engines don't rev as high as bike engines. And there's a very good reason for that, because we have a physical limit, and that relates back to the stroke length. How fast can a piston move maximum inside a cylinder up and down? So how many meters per second can that piston travel? And that is limited. And that is why we have a big difference between a car engine and a bike engine. We talk about long stroke and short stroke engines. And I'm going to give you the example in a few minutes. But first, let's have a look what stroke is all about and how that actually relates to torque. I mentioned to you already a couple of times torque. And as you might have noticed, the torque on the car engine is much bigger than the torque that we have on the bike engine. And there's a couple of good reasons for that. But let me first of all explain you what torque is about. What I have here is a crankshaft. And in the back here we would have the flywheel. And here we would have the distribution chain. And of course we would have 4 pistons. I only mounted one because I can't hold them all at the same time. So imagine that this is our cylinder here and the piston is sitting inside. So the crankshaft has rotated to the top dead center, and now we're getting the spark. And when the spark happens, that mixture is going to explode and the piston will be pushed down. And by the fact that the piston is pushing down, we're getting a lever action on the crankshaft, and the piston, which is doing a lateral movement, is now converting that power into torque to a rotational movement. So now the piston is at bottom dead center, and then it goes back up for exhaust stroke, but meanwhile other cylinders will already have their compression stroke. So what I'm trying to say here is that the way the crankshaft is rotated and the force by which it's rotated, this is what we call torque. What is the torque? What is the force that makes the crankshaft rotate? Because at the end of the day, we need only rotational forces through the gearbox, through the differential, through the drive shafts and the wheels to propel the car forward. And we're getting this force from the horsepowers developed inside the cylinders. So the cylinders do a lateral movement up and down that is converted to a torque factor. So think about torque like this. You have a bolt that you need to unlock and you're using a spanner for that, and you just can't get it done. You have X amount of force, and I don't have a lot of force, but you might have more, but we have X amount of force and I just can't get it done. Well, we have a lever action here, but it's short. So what do? Well, we replace the short handle with a longer handle. You know, that's a big difference, about twice as long. I still have the same force, but I can put far more torque up, and now I can unlock it. Here we have the crankshaft, and these are the bearings of the crankshaft itself, and on those connections we connect the pistons just like the first one. I could draw a line right through the center of the crankshaft, like so. And then I could draw also a line through the center of the part where the big end connects, of the piston. And you can see that we have an offset here. So that distance here is acting like a lever. So what I'm saying is that when the piston is at top dead center, we get combustion, and it's that combustion that develops horsepower, and it's going to push the crankshaft around, and it's going to convert that horsepower into torque, and a lot depends on that lever that we just looked at. The longer the lever, you would think the more torque we're going to get, and that's a reality. However, we should not forget that when the crankshaft keeps on rotating, at some moment in time the piston needs to go back up for another compression cycle. And that compression cycle, it is the crankshaft driving the piston upwards to overcome the pressure at the end inside the cylinder. And that's going to take some force from the crankshaft to push it up. And this is actually the opposite force. Here, it's the crankshaft delivering force to the piston. However, the lever here plays a very important role. Now, the longer the lever is on that stroke, the tougher it is for the crankshaft to push that piston up. Let me give you a little example. If I'm holding the hammer like this, I can hold it for a long time. But if I'm holding the hammer like this, oh, this is more heavy, I won't be able to hold it long. It takes more force from me to hold it like this. And that is the lever length, which is now changed, right? So it's the same thing with the piston. But the point is that the combustion, the explosion, is far more powerful than actually the compression cycle. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about short and long strokes. So when the piston is at its bottom dead center, and then it moves to the top dead center, that piston has traveled a certain distance, and that distance is what we call the stroke. So top dead center to bottom dead center. And how much that stroke is depends on the crankshaft and the lever we looked at before. We basically have two types of engines, a short stroke engine and a long stroke engine. In general, the long stroke engine develops more torque and runs lower RPMs. A short stroke engine runs higher RPMs but develops less torque. And that's what we see in bikes. Typically these are short stroke engines just because they need to reduce that mass of that engine because it has to fit in a bike. On a car it's different, we have more space. Now, why can't we run up the car engine to 10,000 RPMs? Why can't we run up a long-stroke engine to a high RPM? Because that would be beneficial for the horsepower. Well, the reality is that there is a limited time. It's a physical constraint on how fast a piston can travel inside a cylinder. Now, let's say, for the sake of argument, have a speed of 10 meters or inches or whatever per second that the piston can travel inside a cylinder, and this is kind of like a design limitation, it's a physical limitation. If I had a short stroke engine which has a stroke of 2, then that piston can move 5 times, because 5 times 2 is 10. So that's a lot of RPMs. If I had a long stroke engine, which is having, let's say, a stroke of 5, that same piston can only move twice inside that cylinder, because it cannot exceed the 10 per second. And that is the explanation why short stroke engines are doing typically far more RPMs, because the piston has to travel less distance. So in terms of horsepower and torque, I'm going to give a plus to the car engine because I'm running lower RPMs and I have a better torque, and lower RPMs means less wear and tear and also less consumption. So the next thing we need to look at is the clutch, and that is in many cases an issue when you put a bike engine into a car. Typically the bike is around 180 kilograms and you add the engine to it and then you add the driver to it, and you're probably ending up with around 250, 260 kilograms. And the clutch is designed to propel that mass, so the bike and the driver, considering the horsepower and the torque that the engine develops. However, if you place that engine now into a race car or into a car where the mass is quite a bit bigger, it's about to double, the car is probably around 400 to 500 kilograms, including the driver. Now all of a sudden that clutch is far more stressed, and it is not uncommon that the clutch actually starts to slip, and you might have seen pictures from me or videos from me when I was driving this car on the track where my clutch started to slip, despite the fact that I do have a new clutch in the car. So you will have to upgrade the clutch in your bike engine. Maybe you need stronger springs, and you're certainly going to need a race-based clutch. So that is something really to keep in mind. So let's have a look on a bike clutch and a normal car clutch. So let's have a look on the clutch of the motorbike engine, and this is the clutch mechanism. It's multiple friction plates that have been squeezed together with strong springs. And this whole unit here you should really replace with stronger clutch plates for racing purposes, because this is the part that's going to propel the car and the driver, and that's the part that's going to slip. So this is one of the plates, and there are many of them, and make sure that you do replace these with racing or high performance discs or plates. In addition, you might want to get stronger springs or put some washers in the front here, so that puts up more pressure. This is the clutch of a car, and you can see it's far more sturdy. I can see the clutch itself, and it has far more surface. Of course, if you add up all the little clutch plates inside the bike, you probably end up to the same, but overall the pressure group here, and this is the pressure group, is a bit stronger. You see these fingers here, that's what's pushing the clutch against the flywheel. So if this is not strong enough, then the clutch will slip. Now this will come in different strengths, and this is an ordinary one, this is nothing special. But if you're going to get a racing clutch, then you have a high pressure group. You may even have ceramic discs specifically for racing. So for a car, this is going to be much easier to deal with. So therefore, I think the bike engine is actually getting a negative from me, because you will have to do a lot of adaptations. Now let's focus on the gearbox. A race car typically has what we call a dog box, and this is an LD204 Hewland gearbox in which I can change the gears within half an hour. The gears inside are straight cut teeth, So I can remove this back end, then take out all the gears, change the gear ratios, and then put it back all back in together depending on the racetrack you're going to race on, and that all within about 30 minutes. These are very strong race boxes, and we call those dog boxes because of the ring that bites into the gears. So this is really built for racing, and you can see the gearbox is at the end of the car. So with a bike it's a bit of a different story. With a bike engine, the gears are embedded in the casing of the entire engine. So you would have to take the engine out of the car, then you would have to take the engine apart and then potentially change the gear ratios of the gearbox. It's a lot of work and it's really not practical to do so. However, the bike engine has some benefits. The bike engine is having 6 gears, so 1 down and 5 up. That means that we can shift sequentially. First gear, come back. Second, come back. Third, come back. Fourth, come back. Fifth, come back. Sixth, come back. So in essence, we have a sequential gearbox that allows you to shift fast, and it has a good safety feature as well. You cannot shift from 6th to 3rd gear or from 6th to 1st gear. You always need to go through the gears, which really can save your life sometimes. Because if you make a mistake on the track and you shift from 4th gear to 1st gear at a too high speed, you may actually get into a slip and have some really nasty things happening to you. So therefore, the bike engine is good. It's a sequential gearbox, fast shifting, and you can make no mistakes. On the other hand, the car engine, well, that typically has an H pattern, right? So we need to move the lever around like in an H pattern. Quite different. So you're losing time. Typically you have 4 or 5 gears and a reverse. On the bike, you have no reverse, so you may have to put an extra motor on if you need to back up with the car. So that's something to keep in mind. So in terms of gearbox, I think I'm going to give the car the same as the bike engine. The bike engine is swiftly in shifting, it's sequential, so that's good, you can make no mistakes. It may in some cases be a little bit slower in shifting, especially if you have to skip gears because you have to walk through the gears. Then an H-pattern gearbox on a car might be better. But overall I think the benefits and the drawbacks of both, it levels out. Although I still prefer a car gearbox with less gears and more torque, because at the end everything adds up. But it all depends on what kind of purpose you're using the car for. I can imagine if you're into hill climbing, it's a bit of a different story than when you drive on the track. So this is something you would have to work out for yourself. The next thing is, of course, the differential. Now on a car engine we have a differential, and then we have the shafts going to the rear wheels, and our differential can actually have a limited slip or not. That means that if we're going to corner, we will compensate in the differential for the inner arc and the outer arc, which is pretty good. But then again, on the straight line, one wheel may slip more than the other one because there may be a little bit of oil on the track, things like that. So that is what a normal car would do. A car with a car engine typically has a differential, and this is what we have on the other race car. On this car, I also have a differential, although I have a motorbike engine. Now typically motorbikes don't have a differential. You know, it has one wheel in the back where all the torque is on, so why would you need a differential? But if you put a bike engine into a race car, then you might want to think about having a differential and adding a differential to the equation. So add something to it, because that bike engine will have a sprocket in the front of the engine and a chain, and then you need to drive the rear wheels with it somehow. So some people use a stiff or rear axle which is connected solidly between the two wheels, and that gives you the effect of driving a go-kart, because that's what go-karts have. It's a different way of driving, and you may not like this. Personally, I'm not too keen on that. So, but that again, it all depends on what you want to do. So if you're going to put a bike engine into a car, think about it. Do I want to have a stiff rear axle with no differential, or do I want to have a differential or a limited slip differential? So this is something you have to engineer and add to it. So let's have a look on this car what we have. So on this car you can see I have fitted a differential with a big sprocket on where the chain goes over, and then I have my drive shafts going to the left and to the right. So you have to construct this whole arrangement in order to make sure that you can actually tighten up your chain and that you have a differential. Now you can buy these differentials, that's not the issue. And one other challenge will be the drive shaft, be it a stiff rear axle or not, but you will have to have a proper made and constructed drive shaft going between the wheel hub and actually your differential or your stiff axle. So that is typically custom made then. So that's going to drive up the cost. The shafts that I have on this car, I had them made for me, and this costed me about 900 euros for the two. In terms of differential, I think the bike engine, I'm going to give it a negative compared to the car engine, because you have to make a lot of changes. And when I say negative, it doesn't mean it's going to be worse, it's going to drive badly. No, it's just more work, things you need to consider. You need to build more things. That's why I'm going to give it a negative. So this is something to think about. Installing a bike engine into a car is practically a lot of work. So for that, the bike engine had for me a negative compared to the car engine. And that of course is considering an equal car engine to be replaced with a car engine. So not going from a V4 to a V8, because then you have to do a lot of adaptations as well. We then also looked at the overall weight, and that is a big win for the bike engine. It really wins out compared to the car engine by about 80 kilograms, which is a lot. We then looked at the horsepower and torque, and there I favor the car engine. Lower RPMs and actually more torque, because it's a long stroke engine compared to the bike engine, which is running at high RPMs, has the same amount of horsepower but less torque. So I think for that I prefer the car, but again, it all depends for what you're going to use the car. We then also looked at the clutch, and the clutch can be a problem on a bike engine because of slippage, so you need to adjust that, so that's a bit of work to be done. So I made that a negative for the bike. So then we also looked at the gearbox, and again here I think the car wins out by far because it's far more flexible compared to the bike. And then we have been looking at the differential, and that is a matter of choice. Let's keep those equal because you can add a differential to your bike engine if you want to, or you can drive with a stiff rear axle. If you like the go-kart feeling, again, it all depends for what you use the car. And then finally, we had actually looked at the drive shafts and so on, so the adaptation that you need to do there. We also looked actually at the shifting. I forgot to mention that for the gearbox, that the gearbox had some good things in shifting, sequential shifting versus an H pattern, and that you cannot miss gears from 6th to 1st, for instance, or 6th to 3rd. You cannot make that mistake because you have to shift through all of them, going down or going up. With an H pattern, you can make that mistake. So overall, it really depends what you like to do with it, but now at least you know all the things to look for. Now I've driven both of these cars, the blue one recently, and you might have seen the video on it. It goes fast, it can keep up with the Formula Fords, but I had a problem with my clutch. This one, I've driven it as well, but it still needs to be restored fully. And it goes well as well. It's a different way of driving. So if I have the choice, I'm going with a car engine. I think it's more fun. Of course, the sound on a bike engine is impressive, right? The high RPMs. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and please, by all means, provide your comments. And thank you for viewing. Bye-bye.